More than anything, neuroscience shows me that the human person is a mystery. You always need to look at the context that a person's in, the subjective experience of that person and what they're reporting is going on in their interior life. Without these things, you can't understand the meaning of human action. It's irreducible to biology.
Welcome to Purposeful Lab, a Magis Center podcast. I'm Katherine Hadra with Dr. Dan Keebler. Here we are at the end of season 2 already. It's flown by.
It's been an exciting season, some great guests we've had on, and we still have another great guest for our last episode.
We're going to be speaking with a neuroscientist all about how behavior affects the brain, truly rewires the brain. Dr. Sophia Carosa is a renowned Catholic neuroscientist. She earned a degree in neuroscience and theology, which is, I think, a perfect blend for our purposes.
Yes.
From the University of Notre Dame. She graduated as a valedictorian in 2019, so she's very young as well and impressive. Let's get to it with our interview with Dr. Sophia Carosa.
Sophia, thanks for taking the time to sit down with us. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Great. So just before we get into sort of what your talk was here at the meeting, why don't you tell us a little bit about the research you did for your PhD, which you just finished?
Yeah, just submitted a couple of weeks ago.
Awesome.
So my thesis was on the effect of abuse and neglect on child brain development, and specifically applying the methods of network science to this question of how it is that children adapt to early experiences of adversity. So I reconstructed the structural brain networks of lots of different children and then used computational models to try to understand how they might differ and why based on experiences of deprivation and threatening experiences early in life.
Okay. So looking to see how do they adapt to that, or how the brain tries to sort of overcome like developmental
how it shapes the brain exactly in a way that then might account for some psychological and psychiatric outcomes that we see later in life.
Well, it's interesting you talk. One of the things that I really struck me was you talk about how the brain is a relational organ.
And
I think that there's biological and theological sort of stuff underneath that to unpack, but what do you mean, like from a biological perspective? How do you see the brain as a relational organism and organ? And how does that work? Right?
Yeah, it's really one of the most beautiful facts of the brain, I think. The brain as a relational organ. When I use that phrase, what I mean is that over the course of childhood, even embryonic development, the primary driver of the emergence of the structure and function of the human brain is loving relationship. First with the mother, and then with the mother and father, and then a broader community. But it's, especially you see this in the postnatal period, so after birth, the factor that shapes which connections are kept in the brain and which ones are eliminated, and how neural circuits are organized to support behavior. The factor that drives all of that is the interactional landscape. And so the kinds of social exchanges that babies have with their parents, of talking and gazing at objects together, and touch is so important. And all of these provide the sensory information that from the outside to within shapes brain structure. And again, in a way that sets the foundation for a lifetime of cognition and emotional regulation and behavior and health. And so, so you can't understand the brain or anything that the brain supports throughout the lifespan without looking at the developmental history of the brain. And when we're looking at the child, you can't understand a child's behaviors or abilities without an understanding of what that child has been through and where that child has come from, specifically when it comes to relationships. And I find this really beautiful. As you mentioned, there's a lot of theological resonances with what it means to be made in the image of God. And and also it's such an occasion for compassion as we encounter others who might be exhibiting behaviors or suffering in ways that we don't understand, to ask what might have happened to this person.
What relationships have been deprived.
Exactly.
Because looking at psychology, you see these stages of development, and so if you don't have the proper relationships at one stage, it's hard to form. So it's not just the brain development, but it's throughout your life. There's a relation.
There's an expectation of relationship. Yeah. And that's the foundation upon which we have to build.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And from a theological perspective, because obviously we're not disembodied brains, right?
Right.
We are.
Right.
We are. It's not our brain and our body, but we are. We are one. We are relational organisms, not just a relational. Our brain is very indicative of how relationships affect us, but we are relational.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In a way. And how do you see that sort of resonating with, say, a theological understanding of a human person from an anthropological sense of Christian anthropology?
Yeah. So I always think of it in terms of the first creation narrative in Genesis, and when the Lord makes the human person in his image and likeness, and this is a God who's revealed himself to be Trinity. And so to be a relationship of love amongst these three persons, and that all of creation, but most especially the human person, is the outpouring of that Trinitarian life. And so the human person's destiny, origin and destiny, is in this Trinitarian love. And so to most flourish as a human being is to become relational, more relational, to embrace interdependence and to find one's fulfillment in these relationships of love. And I think it's beautiful to see not just a reflection of that in our biology, but actually the means through which that's achieved on the physical level in our biology. It's in allowing ourselves to be shaped and nourished by others, and then providing that for them in turn. That's what constitutes our flourishing on the biological level. And I think that's beautiful that at every level, we see there's a unity to the human person, a unity to our calling, our vocation, that can be such a source of esteem for the dignity of what's given to us in like our ordinary family interactions. Yeah.
It makes you see people, I think, in a different light, because we're in a culture where, and again, I fall victim to this all the time, thinking of I'm a self-made person, I'm autonomous, I can do what I want, I want to achieve what I want, and that it's listening to you talking, thinking it through, that's counterproductive to our own flourishing to think that way, right?
It is.
It's really, you see yourself as the obligations almost you have to other people to help them flourish in relation. And so the brain development, their normal, that's the way we're meant to be, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And how all reality, like you said, the Trinity, all reality is relational. So it's hard to, nothing exists in isolation.
In isolation, exactly.
Yeah. That's great. So, one of the things that often, I'm in brain science, typically, people see that as a way to understand the brain. If we understand the brain, we understand what fires in Sophia's neurons right now. We know what's going on. We can reduce you to your neurons. So if we do imaging of your brain and see this area is active, we've understand your behavior and so forth. Certainly understanding what's going on in the brain is important for understanding an embodied person. But what are the limitations? So you talk about what are the sort of the expectations that you should have, what neuroscience can deliver and what it can't deliver, right? Because I think there's this danger that people think neuroscience can explain all there is to know about who you are, who I am,
right?
So,
and so anything that lies beyond that limit must not exist. So neuroscience is, as you said, an important and beautiful window into reality. And obviously, as a neuroscientist, I have a certain esteem for this.
You must, yes. You want to get your
so
PhD,
having said that, I would just absolutely affirm that there are also very narrow limits when it comes to what neuroscience can tell us about the human person. So to take your example of looking at the activity of a particular brain region and trying to relate that to a behavior, use it to explain a behavior. Now, let's take the example of reasoning, right? Okay, so trying to problem solve. If we understand what the brain is doing during problem solving, we might have a better account of the particular steps that are being taken. We might have a better understanding of how, on the biological level, the structure of your brain is supporting the functions that are necessary for that cognitive process to happen. So it can be valuable to look at the brain. But what it can't tell you is the content or the meaning of your reasoning. and it can't give you a picture of the significance or the moral value of your action or the context in which it's taking place. It's a very, very narrow, mechanistic, procedural look at that particular behavior. So it can't tell you what something is. It can tell you how it's being realized on the biological level, but it's not going to answer questions of meaning or value or substance or essence in any way.
Yeah.
And so, so that doesn't mean it's useless, but it does mean that just because we can locate something in the brain doesn't mean it doesn't also exist on higher levels of reality that can't be reduced to biology. But because we're not a soul and body as two separate things, but embodied souls or ensouled bodies. And so, of course, we would expect to see brain activity during something like reasoning or emotions or in love. And that's perfectly consistent. I'd be surprised, shocked, and a little scared if we could find no trace in the nervous system of any activity happening when you fell in love. But it's completely unreasonable to think that just because there's neural activity doesn't mean that there's also a reality above that can't be reduced to it.
Yeah. No, it's like interesting. Well, this is the God area of the brain. So when that's active, then you're just imagining God. But God is going to interact with us, and we're embodied people. Well, my brain should be active when I'm interacting with God. Yeah. So but it does help us understand like mental defects, and there are people that are unable to have proper or flourishing relationships because of So there is a usefulness of that, and also a usefulness of knowing what areas of the brain seem to be more active when you do certain things.
And how they interact and what can help, what can support this process that we're interested in, whatever it is, on the neurological level. So not even considering those who might have difficulties or disorders, but even in what we would call quote unquote normative population, we can really understand what makes for human flourishing on the biological level, and so support those higher level realities that we're interested in. And so, yes, I think it's a very useful tool for that. But it depends upon prior commitments and understandings and concepts that you have that don't come from the science itself. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. So great. What are those prior commitments? And maybe give two extreme examples of those.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, for example, there are common studies of free will, where researchers will ask participants to flex their finger at any time that they desire, and they're measuring brain activity and trying to find a pattern of brain activity that precedes the flexion of the finger, and reliably detect this in a way that can make them predict when this participant will flex their finger. And they ask the participants, at what point did you decide to flex your finger? And they show that we can measure brain activity before the participant reports having a conscious decision to flex their finger. So what this seems to say is, well, based on my readout of your brain, I can predict what you're going to do next. Therefore, your idea of freedom is actually an illusion. So this is one extreme example of how this is weaponized ideologically, the study of the brain. But what's very important to understand here is, even beyond some of the methodological limits of these studies of free will, is that it's presupposing a particular conception of free will that is then operationalized in the study and informs how the research is designed and interpreted. So in this case, the idea of free will that's being operationalized, loosely speaking, I don't embrace this, so they might correct me. Yeah. But what it seems to be is an assumption that free will is the perfect capacity to always consciously decide the details of when you're going to act on urges for motor movement. So to give you, that's a lot of jargon. So it'd be basically the idea that free will is the perfect capacity to understand what you're doing and to control when you're doing it, when you do something like suppress a cough.
Right. Okay.
Now, I don't know any philosopher who would say, yeah, that's a great definition of free will, right?
Yeah.
And so it's really important to think, like, when you're confronted with experiments like these, how are they conceptualizing the concept at play, whether it's love or free will or the experience of God or fear or whatever it is, and to really scrutinize that because, yeah, I don't deny that you can predict when I'm going to suppress a cough based on my brain activity, but I don't think that's at all incompatible with free will, which I understand to take place on a longer time span and to not always mean that I have perfect freedom, and because I am constrained and limited, and I don't always have conscious awareness of my freedom because of the way that habits and the virtues form us and things. So that's one extreme example. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, exactly. Because when you try to define free will in an experimental fashion, you often reduce it to something you can measure because you can't have somebody sitting there. I'm going to measure your free will as you think about what you're going to do with the rest of your life. Yeah. You don't make you're not going to, it's something you can't measure in the lab.
It has to be a discrete decision that's measurable and standardized across individuals, which is another really important thing. Okay. So flexing a finger is relatively, but you have to narrow so much to be able to measure something in the laboratory. So,
well, it's interesting you talked about, how, we talk about, humans have free will, but you're also constrained by your habits and your behaviors and your sins, right? And it was something you talked about. You talked about neuroplasticity, which is the ability of neurons to change their speed of firing, their connections, and so forth. So your brain will change based on what you do over time. So I want to talk a little bit about how that might, how that resonates with sort of virtue and habit formation in brain, and how that, rather than explain away our free will, sort of
exalts it, I would say. Absolutely. Yeah, so it's really beautiful, the fact of neuroplasticity, the change of the brain over time through, it really varies based on what part of the brain you're looking at, what capacity you're looking at, what scale you're looking at, but a variety of different biological mechanisms that mean that the brain is not set in stone, and that our every experience, if you go away from this conversation remembering anything that we've talked about, it will entail a change in your brain, which is remarkable that we're constantly, Edith Stein has this wonderful line about human beings, that we're beings in a state of becoming. And I think I see that in the brain in this case. And as you mentioned, when it comes to virtue, I think this is particularly important because the choice of the good makes us grow in our capacity to choose the good. And so we can participate in this way in becoming more of who we want to be and are made to be. And how you see this in the brain is for example, in choice of behaviors, consolidating neural circuits that support those behaviors. And so your choice to take a very simple example, to smile at your family members first thing in the morning. If you make that what might feel like a heroic sacrifice if you're not a morning person, if you make that choice repeatedly and consistently over time, what's going to happen in your brain is the formation of new connections and the strengthening and myelination of existing connections that makes it easier for you to choose that good, which doesn't mean your freedom's not involved later, but it becomes more of a habit broadly understood for you to greet people with charity and cheerfulness in the morning. And that if we had a transparent picture of your brain structure, it would show that that's what you've done. You've become someone who smiles at people in the morning. And I think that's really beautiful. And it gives us a sense of the dignity and importance of attending to our actions and choosing intentionally those actions that do align with what we most desire, with who we're most called to be. And it gives us a sense too of the gravity of our capacity for sin, that we are turning ourselves in our act of sin into someone who sins more, who is further from the Lord. So it's beautiful to see this realized through our materiality, because again, it's not like the soul's over there or some like ghostly substance that's acting through like my body's a puppet. But it's the organization and the form of the body. And so in my body, it reflects that I have freedom and I have the capacity to shape who it is that I become. I mean, it's a drama. It's a wonderful existence.
Because it really does, because it seems often you think, oh, you are your choices, right? In some esoteric sense, but here it is. Your choices are actually embodied
in the flesh.
Really a wonderful, rich idea. So I think you talked about how neuroscience can help illuminate, and we hit on this, illuminate what it means to be human. And I think, you've hit on a few of these things. I think a lot of times, as we talked about neuroscience, people think it illuminates that humans are nothing more than a brain. Mm-hmm. But if you were to try to sort of counter that argument about, hey, this is what I see from neuroscience and how it shows that I'm much more than a brain, or much more, how would you
correct
that?
Yeah. Advance a positive account. I would say neuroscience, more than anything, neuroscience shows me that the human person is a mystery.
Okay.
Very far from providing a comprehensive and exhaustive account of the nature of the human person. Neuroscience shows that the human person is a mystery. And we see this, any number of ways. To give one example, there's this fact of multiple realizability. So this is the idea, very well substantiated with scientific evidence, that for the vast majority of our, not just abstract thoughts, but behaviors, there are many different configurations of neural activity that can provide biological substrates for that behavior. So there are multiple real states that can realize what we see, the same thing that we see on the cognitive or behavioral level. And so observing someone from the outside, you don't know what's happening in their brain. And the implication by reverse is that you can have vastly different patterns of brain activity that you're measuring, and you don't know what behavior they would be supporting, or someone in the real world, and so it's very far from in the popular mentality, there's this idea that there's a one-to-one correlation between some brain activity and some higher level behavior, right? And so you if you can read someone's mind, you know what they're thinking, or you can know what they're going to do, and that's not true at all. There's across individuals and within individuals over time, it's remarkably heterogeneous. And so you always need to look at the context that a person's in, the subjective experience of that person and what they're reporting is going on in their interior life. Without these things, you can't understand the meaning of human action. It's irreducible to biology. So that's one place I see that the human person is a mystery. But there are any number of things that no matter how much you know about a person's early life, you don't know what is going to happen to them later. You can't say for sure they're going to develop this mental illness, or that they're, going to have this IQ or anything like that, that there's human freedom there, or, you name it, that you point to any domain in neuroscience and we see the human person's a mystery.
Yeah. So, I think that resonates with, and not only is the human person a mystery, but the whole universe is a mystery, right?
Yes.
And I'm a cell biologist, so you study cells. There's just simple things we should know, but the more we study them, the more we realize we can't predict what they're going to do unless you look at like whole populations of cells, like one at a time. It's sort of stochastic, which is kind of like what happens with neurons. Exactly. There's a stochastic nature, but you look at enough of them, there's a pattern there, but it's still not enough to.
Yes.
But if you look at one or two, they might be.
I'm so glad you brought this up. I've been thinking about stochasticity and development a lot more lately. I think it's so underappreciated within neuroscience as a contributor. And to me, it's so beautiful because it leaves so much room for the unpredictable and surprise in the dynamic of human life. And I think it's very important and well substantiated, as you said, from the very neuronal scale all the way up to macroscopic brain development. So,
that's great. So you are just finishing your PhD, and then you're heading on to do a postdoc. So if you want, you should share what your research is going to be in your new endeavors.
Sure. So I'm moving on to a postdoc, continuing to look at the effects of early adversity on the brain. But I'm taking additional computational models to look both at human brain evolution and then trying to bridge biological and artificial neural networks. So I'm going to look at how adverse environmental exposures and human sociality might have shaped the evolution of the brain over recent evolutionary history of our species. That'll be the first half of the project. And then the second half will be taking the biological neural networks of a large group of children, turning them into artificial neural networks, and then training them on various tasks to see whether or not adversity in their early life changes these statistical properties of the artificial neural networks, changes their capacities for learning or memory in ways that might correspond to human cognition. So I'm not sure if I'll find anything. Maybe the answer will be it doesn't at all. And I'm very open to that. Very, very open to null results. But I'm excited to be able to sort of push the bounds of what people are doing computationally in the study of early adversity.
Okay. Yeah. So this is an interdisciplinary lab.
Yes, I'm very grateful to have the support of an interdisciplinary lab. We've got a philosopher, sociologist, a neurologist, some good statisticians. So I'm in good hands.
That's wonderful. It's good to see, because I think science, and it has been moving in this direction, I think, in the last 20 years. Instead of, it's been so siloed. And now to answer some of these bigger questions, we realize, no, mathematicians need to talk to biologists, need to talk to neurobiologists.
It's remarkable how many blind spots we have. We don't do that.
Right. That's wonderful. Well, I appreciate sitting down and talking.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a joy.
Yeah, and best of luck as you start your postdoc here.
Thank you. Thanks.
Well, Dan, that was a fascinating conversation. I'm jealous I couldn't be there myself, and I'm hopeful, and I think we'll have her on in future seasons, I'm sure, just because there's so much to unpack there, and the field of neuroscience is just fascinating. What stood out to you the most from your conversation?
Yeah, I think, and I can't wait to have her back on and have a longer discussion on any one of these topics that we hit upon in the interview. But I think the relationality of the brain, how the brain is a relational organ, and how that reflects how humans are to flourish as a human being, requires right relationships, and how from the very beginning, your brain is shaped by your relationships with everyone you interact with, particularly during development. And it goes against the counter to the sort of culture idea of I'm autonomous, I create my own reality. It's like, no, from the very beginning in utero, in the womb, your brain is forming, and it's dependent upon the choices of another person. And what that person, what your mother does, affects how your brain develops. And then, in the first few years of life, the way the brain wires up depends upon your proper interactions with other people. And it continues throughout life. And for us to flourish, it's how interdependent we are. We don't create ourselves. We're created, by our relations.
Even just this aspect of we are dependent on one another. It reminds me, harkens back to our season 1 finale with Father Spitzer, who talked about the 4 levels of happiness. And for our human flourishing, we are dependent on others to get outside of ourselves, to love and serve others. That actually we're designed that way. And that's what leads to our purpose and our flourishing and our happiness. So it's fascinating to speak with these different experts in various fields and get to the same conclusion, about how we are relational beings, truly. And that's reflected in our body.
Yeah, and it's reflected in our it's interesting how you have this feedback loop where that's reflected in our choices. But our choices, because our brain, as she talked about, has this neuroplasticity, right? So our choices affect, how our brain changes over time, and the way our brain changes then affects our choices. And so this habit formation and virtue formation or vice formation that, when you do certain things, certain habits, it affects how your brain is structured, which then makes it easier or harder to overcome those vices, or easier to practice those virtues. It's just very sobering to realize how much what we choose affects what we become.
And that we can, change our habits and virtues and what have you. But no, that was so fascinating. And again, I think she offers this unique perspective as both neuroscientist, but she has this theology background as well, melded together. I think a great way to end season 2.
Yeah, no, it shows, particularly, the relationship between faith and science, and how, one doesn't overcome the other, but they complement the other. And you have this danger of thinking, the brain can explain all of my behavior. That fails. And then, faith, the brain has nothing to do with my behavior. And, everything is just, some spiritual struggle. Right. Well, we do have a biology, our brain, and that does affect, our choices and our habits and so forth. But we do have the ability to modify those to some extent. Yeah.
And we are now at the office hours segment of Purposeful Lab Podcast, where we get to ask Dr. Dan Keibler all types of questions and get your questions answered. All right, Dan, I have this first question I have for you for office hours is something I'm personally curious about. I'm going to throw this your way.
Okay.
I want to get your take on something that is surging in popularity, and that is cold plunging. I don't know if you've heard of this or if you've seen this online in social media. I've never done it. I don't think I could personally handle it, but it involves fully submersing the body in cold water, like a bathtub or a tank or a different body of water. And many claim it relieves muscle soreness, it aids recovery, it reduces inflammation, boosts immunity. But what's your take on this? Like, is this something smart to do for your health, or is this dangerous to just constantly submerge your body in freezing water?
Yeah, it's a very interesting phenomenon. It's the exact opposite of what you think you would want to do with your body. Plunging yourself into cold water particularly can cause a lot of stress on the heart and the heart arrhythmias. So it's not something that you want to do if you've got poor health or whatever. Certainly talk to your doctor before you do that. But there is some science behind it that maybe it would have some benefits, because just like with exercise, you stress your body and it gives you some benefit. Putting your body, submersing it in cold, will stress your body, and if you stress, sort of a mild stressor on the body can lead to sort of benefits long term. Just like if you exercise too much, it could damage your body. Just like if you get into cold water for too long, and you could really damage your body. So that's why it's kind of concerning. People that just do it and I'm going to jump in and so forth. But there's not many good high quality studies on this. So. There could be other factors. So it's known that people that swim in cold water have certain health benefits, but could it just be because of the exercise? And they're often adapted to that. So, and it doesn't, when in animal models, when they do cold stress on animals, it increases certain genes that are associated with health and longevity. So it does seem to have, there's some biological basis behind it, but a lot of the things that people promise and so forth, I think they overhype, and I would just caution, it's not something you want to just throw your body into, and particularly if you have any heart conditions, because it is a stress on you the older you get. If I threw myself in cold water, I don't think it would be beneficial.
It's so individualized, but that's interesting because you're an athlete as well, so it's interesting to hear your perspective on that, and just don't put yourself in cold water for an indefinite period of time.
Right,
like there is an impact on the body.
Definitely. Yeah. And athletes always I'm going to jump in a cold ice bath and so forth afterwards. And that can reduce swelling and inflammation, but also can do some damage too. So you got to be very careful.
You heard it from here. Well, this next question I think is right up our alley when it comes to Purposeful Labs. So Angelus News conducted a recent interview with Brother Guy Consolmagno, who is known as the Pope's astronomer. He's the director of the Vatican Observatory and president of the Vatican Observatory Foundation. And this interview was all about how faith informs science. So again, right up our alley.
Exactly.
And Brother Guy said he really sees the universe as, quote, the second greatest story ever told, and compared scientists to what inspired authors of the Bible did, that they convey the truths about God and his creation. What did you make of that comparison and what Brother Guy had to say in that interview?
Yeah, no, I think it was great because he hits on, sort of a tradition in the Catholic world of the two great books, the book of Scripture and the book of nature, right? And I think he's hitting on that truth that you see over and over again, that if you can read the book of nature and not according to what you want it to say, but actually learn from the natural world and the mystery and the beauty and the order in the natural world, that it reveals something about the Creator. So in a sense, just like the author of Scripture is revealing something about God, the scientist who's sort of telling us about how the natural world is structured reveals something about the Creator. Just like, an author, we read a Flannery O'Connor novel, it reveals something about Flannery O'Connor and her, sort of ideas about how humans are fallen and need grace. So you can pick up on her stories, something about her, just like you get information about the natural world, it reveals something about the Creator, right? So I think just like ignorance, I think St. Jerome says, ignorance of Scripture is ignorance of Christ. I think ignorance of the natural world is ignorance of God, because you're not appreciating and fully understanding his handiwork.
That's really well said. There was something that struck me in the interview. Brother Guy is this Jesuit brother. He has this collar, and he says he loves, to see people's reaction where here's this man who's in a collar and he has a ring from MIT.
Right.
That, yes, both can go together. And I think, his work is a witness in and of itself too, combining.
Yeah, that unity. And that, as you know, I'm on the board of the Society of Catholic Scientists, and we gave him the St. Albert Award a few years ago because he embodies this sort of the unity of science and faith.
Yeah. No, I love seeing this topic in the spotlight and in Catholic news. So that was great. And liked getting your reaction from it as well. I want to remind our listeners that we are taking questions for Season 3 of Purposeful Lab, and there's a few ways to do that. Go to MajaCenter.com. You can see all the information there, and you can now call us and leave an audio message with your question, which maybe Dr. Dan Keebler will answer right here on the podcast. That phone number we're putting on the screen for you. We'll put in the show notes, but that phone number is 949-257-2436. 949-257-2436. We want to hear from you, and maybe, again, we'll see what questions we get. We'll see what you'll have to tackle in the next season. But Dan, as we wrap up Season 2, again, what a joy. Again, blown away by all the experts that we've spoken to this season.
Yeah, and I think when you delve into science, it opens up even more questions. So having, Dr. Carosa on, it opens all these questions about neuroscience, and I want to bring other guests on to talk about it, bring her back to talk about. So
big questions that we're going to continue to ask and tackle. And again, I want to remind you, make sure to download and find the podcast on your favorite podcast platform and go to MajaCenter.com for more information. That's a wrap on Season 2. We'll see you next time.